Hi, it's Jeff Allen, and I want to give this is a video I want to do that my son and I were talking. We were talking last week about small talk, why people do small talk. We're talking about the weather, why people talk about the weather, um, and that turned into a really interesting discussion. I love my kids are teenagers now, so they can actually have discussions that we can actually they can actually really thought provoking questions, and then they can actually give some answers that are really thought provoking too, right? And so this is a really cool discussion that I just love to have with my son. This is where finally you kind of feel like you're transferring knowledge, or at least participating in a knowledge transfer in which you're learning at the same time as you're transferring knowledge, right? So I want to talk about the reason for small talk. And I'm going to be really thought provoking and challenging in this to all of us because I want us to really think about what is language, right? And this is kind of part of my what is language thing. And then actually part of my, like, not just what is language, but what is culture. And I'm doing a bunch of books right now on, different cultural, national cultures. I have different book series kind of happening that right now, and I got a lot of things that come out in language and all kinds of stuff. And I got a book that I'm doing on all kinds of the quality of service or assessment, or I think I mean, whatever they want to call these things, right? Um, but the whole thing of why people do small talk. I want to bring it to today, right? And I want to bring in history language, and I got a long history of having done socio-historical language kind of analysis and contemporary. Uh, yeah, I studied a little Latin, right? And Latin and Greek, enough to get myself into trouble, right? so, um, and I've done etymological analyses of words for my own doctoral thesis, right? Going back, and I was trained in lexicology and lexicography too. Yeah, kind of IU, right? Indiana University. Well, it's pretty good for this kind of stuff, right? Um, but the thing, why do people do small talk? So I want us to bring down to what do people talk about? I mean, what are the things that people talk about uh, all the time? What are things that interest people? And I'm talking different cultures, and I'm talking from the American culture point of view. I'm talking for the French culture. I'm talking about Germans, the Brits. I mean, these are kind of, and I actually have a lot of African friends. Okay, that are immigrants in France. Well, decolonized Africa, right? And so they're there. What do they talk about? What do the Caribbeans folks talk about? Because I have lots of friends there too, and Taiwanese too. I mean, what do people talk about? What are things that interest them, right? What do we spend our time talking about? So, I want to simplify it down to a couple things, two or three, maybe four things. So people talk today about. I'm going to relate this back to way, way back. Okay, right? So, what do they talk about? They talk about food. Okay, um, what they eat, what they want to eat, um, what they like eating, and what they want it. And the French, what could be their next meal while they're eating a meal? That's what I was joking about because they don't talk about the meal. They talk about the next meal they want to eat, right? Food. Okay. Um, but that's something you have to do. It's just like essential. Right? If you don't eat, you die. Okay. It's kind of what is how long can you go on a fast? In prison until you die without food. Food. I mean, drinking's what, a month, and then if you don't eat, then how long do you go? So to kind of figure that out. Second thing, um, sex and babies, making babies, and then maintaining the babies after they're born. Right? That's what people talk about. I mean, that's what they do. The guys tend about talking about making the babies, and the women tend about taking care of the babies afterwards. I'm not making any statements here. I'm just this is the women, you see them get together, and I see this all the time. They always have their babies with them, and they're talking about the things they got to do with the babies, right? The guys always joking about this stuff. And I'm not trying to make metal jokes. I'm just because they're always making jokes about this stuff, right? Sometimes not good, but that's what they talk about, right? Well, that's kind of like preserving your species, right? So, and they talk about the weather, what it's like outside to go, and what it's like is you can go do something or not. And people are always complaining whether it's cold or hot, right? So you see this all the time, and people say it's cold. I kind of joke and say, "Hey, it's not cold. You need to grow up in Minnesota, right?" And so I kind of make that joke, or when it's really hot and stuff. So people talk about this, right? Um, and then they talk about. See, what's the fourth one people talk about? I had it in my had the tip of my tongue a minute ago, and I got to think of what it was. Um, Sports. Talk about sports. Okay. Talk about sports. Okay. Um, Go down to the the hairdresser, the barber shop, and the guys are all talking about sports, especially during like sports matches and stuff. Sports, and this is a big thing in the United States. Teams against teams. In France, they don't have really the local teams, but you got the whole countries against countries, the soccer matches, and the whole you know World Cup stuff, and it doesn't matter if it's the World Cup in Europe or on the Eastern hemispheres, or if it's the baseball World Series, or it's the NBA Association for basketball, or the football Super Bowl, or whatever you call it. Things. It doesn't really matter. It's all about sports, right? And that's where a lot of American universities spend all their money is on sports, right? Now I want to kind of bring this back into the history of mankind. Go back thousands of years before we were all like barbarians on before the 700s and all the 600s and 700s, when all the Visigoth invasions of the Germanic tribes into like more Western Europe, or the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes were all in the island there, in what we call UK today, and kind of fighting and stuff, right? And all the Gaulois, the French Gaulois, and what we think of Asterix, and stuff, and they're all kind of hitting each other, right, with fishes. That's all the comic book stuff, right? and before all that, before sending people to going over and people invading other continents, like what was called the new world, right? All before all this. Go back farther. Go back prehistoric, right? Start with all those things that we think we know about. And what did people talk about? What do they think? Well, what they had to do. You can actually see this in commentate things in a lot of traditional oral population stuff, where when people go and kind of do trips, and they make the trip on TV, and they're going to go to a place that's like this exotic land that no one's ever been to, right? And what do the people talk about? What are they sitting there trying to communicate about? What are they doing? Well, they're talking about eating, making babies, and what do you do with the babies, and how do you nurture the babies afterwards? They talk about the weather. It's good or bad weather, do things, right? Now, they don't talk about sports, but I'm going to challenge, say, they did sports, right? They didn't need to make another derivative thing of it, right? So what we have done is, back then, they were hunters and gatherers, right? So, and you kind of have to look at the different populations to see who the hunters and gatherers. We always think of the men as being the hunters, right, and the women as being the gatherers. But actually, there have been populations. Oh wow, like Wonder Woman and the Amazonian ladies. They were all doing both, right? So they were the warriors as well. I mean, that's kind of all science fiction, right? But I mean, there have been different tribes and stuff where women are actually the women's are the movers, right? They're the ones actually breaking up and then tearing down the non-permanent, the nomad homes, right, and still doing things. So they're doing a lot of stuff there. But there are actually there are different tribes where different populations where the women are actually hunters too. Or I mean, this is a lot of the stuff can be stereotypes, right? Whether it's not the real truth or not, but the truth in it is, you got to hunt food. If you don't hunt it, well, you got two different kinds of food. You gather berries, you gather plants, right? You gather that kind of food, and you hunt the stuff that moves. Okay, you got to hunt food that moves. If you don't hunt it, you don't get it. You don't get the meat. Okay, and so you got to hunt those things, right? And look, all these things, all the trips to Africa and stuff, and going on the safaris and stuff, and learn how to hunt. And I'm not going to get into the hunting part of it, where the people that go hunt stuff. I don't want to go into that. People do that just for the fun of it, right? Not because they have to actually eat the meat. But I think about the populations after they want to, and look at the Indians and all the movies you can see about the Indians and how they would hunt the animals down on the North American continent. I mean, I did enough to look at this. Just want to know more about it as I grew up after I'd left the States, right? And I'd done a degree in one of my majors in history, and I wanted to learn any more about the real history of it, right? And it's kind of look at the different movies, and actually the movies, Dancing with Wolves, right? We all kind of laugh at these different movies, but look at what they did. They hunted down animals, and then they took off their hides, and the hides actually became clothing, right? And the rest of the meat became food, and the bones became tools, right? And all kinds of things, right? You try to use as much of the animal as you can. Talk about sustainability. They try to use everything, right? And then so that's the food part. So the hunting and gathering part, right? For food. Then the making babies, well, that's part of it, right? And on top of it, okay, the weather. We're talking about the weather, right? So the weather, good or bad? Well, they don't really talk about while they're talking the weather, good about it. It's just all you care about is can you go out and can you hunt the food or not, right? Can you hunt the food or not? If it's pouring down rain, it's hard to go hunt the food, right? Because the food isn't out there running around because it doesn't want to be out in the rain either. Well, if you're a gatherer, you can hunt, you can get the food, you can gather the food while it's raining, but that's not fun, right? But the food that's actually running around that you got to hunt for, it ain't gonna be running around in the things unless it's in the river, right? Then you can go do it. You got to kind of decide on those things, right? This is so that's all kind of decision making of doing it. So the weather thing is actually an important, very important thing because of whether you can go out or not, and if it's cold or not, right? It's too cold to go out. If it's too hot to go out, then you want to kind of stay cool, right? Doesn't matter if it's Sahara Desert, that kind of thing. But if it's too cold, you want to stay home and make babies. Come on, I'm being truthful here, right? That's then, and what happens in the history of it, we can see that when people stay home, during the winter months, when are the babies born? Well, 9 months after the cold months, right? And look at COVID. When COVID said, how many babies were born after the beginning of COVID? During 9 months. It's just obvious, okay? This is what happens. People stay together, they make babies, okay? And once you got the babies, then you got to decide how to raise them, right? And how to how to raise them in the different ways, right? And how to eventually teach them how to take care of the animals and take care of your own domestic pets, right? And well, goats can be pets too. I mean, or the animals that you actually raise to eat. So a lot of this goes around in circles, right? And this is all essentials, right? These are all essentials of surviving, just survival. And sports, well, back then, they were doing sports. When you're hunting, you are doing sports. You could do sports, right? And when you're taking animals all day long, and you have to feed the animals, you're doing sports. I mean, you gotta go get the food for the animals too. Getting food for animals is just sometimes you gotta get food for the animals. Sometimes they can find their own food. Kind of depends where you're at, right? But all this is sports. So what happens when we become these advanced civilized nations, right? We get to the point where we don't have to do this anymore. We can sit behind computers like this, do videos all the time. And then what you got to do? You got to go do sports at a gym, right? Or at a stadium, or at the university stuff facilities, right? And you got to pay for money to actually do this thing. You got to go pay a gym to actually go do this stuff, right? or COVID when all the gyms are down. You all got to figure out how can you walk outside and go do it with mask or without mask in the forest or not. Okay, right? I mean, come on, folks. This is. We're all kind of laughing about this, but I'm not. Um, so these are kind of the three or four topics that everyone talks about. Why? Because we have talked about this in all of our languages and cultures for how many thousands of years? Okay, this is just part of it. So sometimes some things are kind of primary to the other secondary ones. Like I said, the weather determines whether you can do the food, right? And if you can't do that, then you make babies. I mean, just and it depends at the time of the month, right? So I mean, all this kind of interplays, right? Um, and I'm being thought provoking here because I was talking to my son about it, and he was really interested because yeah, this is actually quite interesting because it all these things are very simple. It's very simple. Yeah, it's very simple. We just make a complicated thing about it because we think we're so advanced that we've become so advanced cultures. Yeah, well, we've done is we've moved away from oral culture. We've moved from oral culture. We've gone to everything's written right now, so everything's going to be written to be able to communicate, which is totally wrong because actually more happens in cultures. That and then talk about storytelling and stuff. Yeah, we do storytelling. We take books and then we turn them into movies, and we tell them we do fairy tales, and we tell the fairy tales to our kids to help our kids grow, right? So that's called the taking care of the babies thing when they're older. Well, they're little kids. You got to tell the stories and get that right. So this is all kind of part of the game. Um, then you tell them how to hunt. Okay? You tell them and train them how to hunt, so they become of the adult age at age 12 to be able to become a man. Yeah, all this kind of Indian cultures and kind of stuff, and they had the whole things that didn't they have this in actually the India Jones movies too? They talk about it's all around age 12, right? Puberty kind of plays in this whole thing, right? Kid's voice, a male child's voice changes, right? It goes from being high voice to a bass range, right? And so it gets hormones and things start happening with the body, right? So and then he got it. They got him to go ahead, be able to become a man, to be able to prove he's a man. So he runs off and does these trials and stuff in Indian cultures, and afterwards he makes babies with the girls, right? But you got to find the wife for him, right? So and arranged marriages all kind of. What are the ages in which you do arranged marriages? Well, early on, right after puberty. But what we do is we turned all these things into we got to study and study and study and studies do. So we're going to do it. And so what happens is it pushes the range off to you got to go do studies and stuff. You got to do all these things. And so you can add 10 years to this, right? Well, that's kind of goes counterculture with our original kind of survival instincts, right? So, um, so what it pushes the whole range off, and it kind of throws off your population generations, right? I'm trying to I'm pushing us to think about it, right? Yeah, there's plenty of you got to go find evidence of this stuff. But I'm thinking us to kind of think about this thing, and why do we talk about these things? Because we've been talking about these for centuries. Um, there's nothing new under the sun in this one, okay? Um, and so my son and I were talking about this, and he was thinking, yeah, this is really cool because this is one of the things that this is really cool to talk about, right? Um, because it just totally makes sense. Um, and you don't have to have like two PhDs in rocket science and in physics and analysis of quantum leap, quantum physics stuff to figure this one out, right? You don't have to be Ant-Man and his father-in-law, right? Okay, and his mother-in-law and father-in-law. You don't have to be those guys. We're the Pims, right? So, or Tony Stark, right? We got to be this to figure this one out. It's possible to kind of know this, right? So I'm yeah. Go ahead and think about that. I hope that is a thought for the day. And it'd be interesting what others think about it. Uh, but I think we just need to not try to figure this one out. Just it's what it is, um, and that's why talk. You got to learn people when they got to do things. People that like to do small talk, you got to learn to do it because that's what everyone else does. 99% of the rest of the population do it, and a few of us we like to talk about more advanced things, right? Well, advanced things are like too advanced for most people because they don't care about it because they want to talk about essential stuff. So all of us weird geeks, we want to talk about the non-essentials. That's the more advanced stuff. So and actually too, so there are some people that they get frustrated because they can't talk with their children because their children aren't old enough to talk about these things. Because you got to spend your time raising your kids to be able to get them to a point where they can actually be adults to actually have the hormonal and the cognitive abilities to be able to understand these kinds of things, right? And so that happens at about, I don't know, age 10 or 12, right? It's hard. You can do it. You can try to do it earlier, but it's not. They gotta have some social experience to actually figure this out, right? You gotta have some social experience, and it actually starts happening when they start being interested in the opposite sex, right? So they start getting teenagers. They begin to understand these things, right? Because they're kind of feeling it, right? So, they're going through hormonal changes too, and all these things. So they're kind of understanding. Oh, this makes sense now. Wow, I understand, right? So that's my thoughts on cultural stuff for today. And I'm not saying that I'm have any hard and fast rules set on this set in stone. Not at all. I'm just kind of thinking about it. But I was thinking about it out loud with my son the other day while we were talking on the phone. So maybe he and I will get to talk again about it in person. And advance more, and I'll have him watch this movie, this film, and he can comment on it. Okay? All right. Have a good day.